And welcome to WritersMosaic. I'm Colin Grant. I'm the director of WritersMosaic. We've been going for about 6 weeks now. Launched 6 weeks ago, still going strong. They haven't pulled the plug yet. We're very happy to be joining you tonight. We're going to be discussing the intersection of novel writing, fiction writing, and history. We're a platform for new writing. And we also have a podcast. We're updated weekly, and we're an initiative of the Royal Literary Fund. So I dreamed up the title. You couldn't make it up, could you, for tonight, which we'll discuss as we go along. I'm joined by three writers who are all either present or soon to be WritersMosaic writers. I think Pat Cumper was one of the first writers to be profiled on the news site. We're going to start with Ingrid Passoud. So Ingrid was born in Trinidad. Her debut novel, Love After Love, won the Costa First Novel Award in 2020. She was also won the BBC National Short Story Award in 2018 and the Commonwealth Short Story Prize in 2017. She's written for several newspapers and magazines, including Granta, The Guardian, and the National Geographic. Her fiction work includes The Vagabond Raja, about a guy called John Boise Singh, who was, quote, a womanizer, gambling king, arsonist, preacher, pirate, thief, human trafficker, gangster, smuggler, and mass murderer. And spoiler alert, crime doesn't pay. You will hear about that later. Ingrid also has a series of short stories specially commissioned by BBC Radio 4. The first one went out on Sunday, just gone, and there'll be 4 others over the next 4 Sundays, starting at 7:45 p.m. So tune in to BBC Radio 4, 7:45 on a Sunday. Ingrid, where are you today?
I'm in South London. So hi from South London.
And who have you got behind you? Is that a Vermeer? What is that?
It's a very cheap museum reproduction, an enlargement of a Vermeer, but it's Lady writing a letter, and so I think it's sort of appropriate in my little space.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ingrid. We're also joined by Pat Cumper, who I've known for about 30 years. I met Pat in Jamaica 30 years ago. Pat began writing for theatre in Jamaica and the Caribbean, where she produced a dozen plays, including The Rapist and The Devil's Concubine. Pat was the artistic director and CEO of Talawa Theatre Company. Talawa is a Jamaican word which means small but mighty, which is a great description of the company. She was the CEO and director from 2006 to 2012. Her play, which we're going to hear about tonight, about Jamaican soldiers in the First World War, Chiggerfoot Boys, was produced in 2017. In fact, Pat, my sister Sonia, who's a writer, reviewed that for Huffington Post and gave it a glowing review. I think you might have liked it because it's on your Wikipedia page. You must have liked it. Pat was also one of the contributors to the New Daughters of Africa anthology, edited by Margaret Busby, and had done many adaptations for BBC Radio, including work by Andrew Levy, Small Island, and Alice Walker's The Colour Purple, which won a Silver Sony Award. Pat, where are you today?
I'm actually in Hitchin. No, I normally I'm in South London as well, but no, this time I'm in Hitchin because I'm visiting family.
Hitchin's a great place, just up the road from Luton, where I was born. So welcome, Pat. And finally, we're going to be joined by Umi Sinha. She's the author of The Longing, which is a tale from the darkest days of the British Raj to the aftermath of the First World War, with 3 interlocking generational stories, a man about their struggles in a troubled history which is steeped in colonial violence. Umi was born in India. She spent the first 10 years of her life at a naval engineering base in the Western Ghats, where her father was stationed. She's been a lecturer in creative writing on the MA course at Brighton and on the creative writing program at New Writing South. Umi also founded a very fine-sounding The Guest House Stories, which is an oral storytelling club. Like all of our writers, she's had many stories published in anthologies, and I think, Umi, you're currently working on a novel called The Fallen, set in Italy during the Second World War. Where are you this evening, Umi? Where are you?
I'm on the Sunshine Coast in Eastbourne, which has indeed been very sunny.
Umi's just down the road from me. I'm in Brighton. And a quick and special hello to my mother, who's also in Brighton, and my mother-in-law who's in Barnby Dun in South Yorkshire, God's own country. In 2015, on BBC Radio 4, the author Jane Smiley says she was condescended to by a conservative historian, Neil Ferguson, who could not see that he too constructs stories. Ferguson believed that Smiley's historical novels were all made up, whereas his research and history books were in the service of facts. Well, tonight we're going to be discussing who gets to write history, how that concretizes history, and what value fiction writers might bring to storytelling and the storytelling of history. Now, my parents are Jamaican, and Pat might correct me if I get this wrong, but I think Jamaicans often say there are no facts, there are only versions. Now, I'm not sure I agree with the first part, but the second part resonates with me. There are the versions of facts, and it's my opinion anyway that historians don't write history, they curate history. So Ingrid, Pat and Umi in that order, is fiction, a start of a 10, is fiction any less true than historical fact? Umi, what do you think? I mean, Ingrid, what do you think? Let's not put Umi on the stage just yet. Umi, take it away. What do you think about that person?
So I think the answer, of course, is yes and no. What fiction brings to the debate is the emotional truth, which is behind so much of the facts. So you can talk about when historians write about Biden and Putin meeting, they will write about the facts of that meeting in Switzerland, but a fiction writer can bring so much more to it. What were the concerns, the apprehensions, the anxieties? How was it choreographed? What was the feeling of the men towards each other before the meeting, during the meeting, when they parted? How did that meeting inform their subsequent decisions that may or may not seem rational to us? So I think that we as fiction writers have a great deal to offer. And as long as we are not as sure as Nell Ferguson is about the world, I think that we can contribute something.
Yeah. So we shouldn't have Titanic certainty about anything, which must question things, but maybe fiction writers deepen the story by digging a bit deeper into what's going on. What do you think, Pat? Do you share that assessment of Ingrid's?
I'm sort of coming at it as a dramatist, and I always say that people come for the story and stay for the relationships. I think what I've always liked about trying to explore historical setting, apart from the lovely things about language and trying to get everything so that it works and creating consistent worlds and so on, is that you actually create characters that people can empathize with. Because it's wonderful to have historical things written. I agree with you, it's curated and not necessarily, there is no one set of things. But there's so much of history that slides away because it's people are either bored by it or they don't see it as relevant to themselves. What drama can do is actually make that history relevant, personal, something that people are interested in. And in that way, it makes the telling of those stories very powerful, because frequently from writers like me, it's essentially subversive of the main narrative that may have been carried by other people. So it has huge power. And oddly enough, a lot of responsibility. I was writing about, in my play, Norman Washington Manley, who was a family friend. And I know what would happen to me if I got that wrong. And one of the most important relationships in his life was with his brother, who died, and he wore a black tie for the rest of his life because of his brother. So you have this huge emotional responsibility as well. But yeah, I think it really boils back down to, there are lots of stories, but it's the relationships, I think, that draw people in.
Thank you, Pat. And Umi, do you share that assertion, by bold assertion, or should it be qualified?
What is your bold assertion?
Well, I suppose that fiction is just as true as historical fact, or can be just as true.
Okay. It was a question I had. I think they're different kinds of truth told in different ways. I think they're both subjective because they're both narrative. And I think Neil Ferguson could only be right about historians telling the truth if they were just presenting a list of undisputed facts, which wouldn't make for very good reading or much understanding, really. I found a quote this morning, actually, on a storytelling forum I'm on. It was about storytelling, but it struck me as apposite to this discussion. It's by Marion Leaper, who's a storyteller, and she said, as soon as a person starts to recount anything as a narrative, they take a journey through the facts of the lived experience that puts a particular truth into the narrative. So the closest anyone can come to telling the truth in a story is to arrive at a version that resonates with someone else's experience of the same thing. And I think in fiction, we do that through the characters. We create experiences that kind of stand for what's happening, and present it in a way that the reader can identify with it. But I think historians do exactly the same thing by selecting their material and by ascribing motives to historical characters. And I mean, in my novel Belonging, there's a section about what the British call the Indian Mutiny and the Indians call the War of Independence. And I think the titles alone say something there, because the Indian Mutiny suggests disloyalty, and treachery, basically betrayal. The War of Independence suggests freedom fighting. And I think the British and Indian versions of the facts basically agree with each other, because all the facts were recorded by the British. You know, history is written by the victors. But I think the interpretations and motives of both sides are presented very, very differently. So you get a completely different story. So I think we're both trying to win the reader over to our point of view in fiction and in history. We're disguising our own agendas. We're presenting them in a way that will engage the sympathies of the reader. But I think maybe fiction is more honest because we're not claiming to be factual.
Thank you, Umi. So the rebellion, the War of Independence that you refer to is the 1857 rebellion. And you focus in part on the Cawnpore violent incident in that rebellion. I'm going to quote you what the historian John Horn has said about your book, beloved Umi. Correspondence and diaries are such wonderful revelations about the intersubjectivity of history. And when one can find ways as a historian to read enough of them, one can cautiously begin to see patterns and make generalizations. So we're relying on archives then, we're relying on correspondence to seed your story. And how did that help?
Well, I think my work is based quite a lot on the facts of history. I don't change the facts. So I think really my plots come from the history. I kind of take the period of history and then build my story around that. But I mean, that thing with John Horn was great, actually, because one of the things he said to me was he was really intrigued by the link between the uprising of 1857, as I shall call it, and the First World War, which also features in the novel. And he thought there should actually be a link with the Second World War, which is actually what I'm doing in my second novel.
I think what inspires me when I think about your work, all three writers actually, is this notion that when I was growing up, there was a kind of absence of stories about people like my parents and my grandparents, and I couldn't find them anywhere. Sometimes I found them in novels. In fact, I found them in Sam Selvon's The Lonely Londoners, which is a story about Caribbean people in London in the 1950s. And that story spoke to me because it resembled the story of my parents. And I wondered, Pat, what fueled your desire to tell the story of Caribbean soldiers in the First World War? What was the impetus for that?
I think a little bit of irritation. You could see the sort of celebrations coming, and you knew what it was going to be. I'd been involved when I was at the High Commission with a lot of people who were trying to get a gate erected in Hyde Park that would commemorate, I think, African and Caribbean soldiers. I think, or perhaps from the Indian subcontinent as well. But there was a strong sense that there were soldiers who had been ignored. So that was one part of it. The other part of it was Norman Manley and knowing that story and the tragedy of a man like that losing his brother, and the irony of him being made an honorary white to Oxford and yet being treated by his peers as inferior, so that he's caught in between. But there was also right at the bottom of it a real desire to tell ordinary Jamaicans narratives, and to be sure that I included Marcus Garvey, whom you've written about as well, who at that time began the war, absolutely began the war by saying, yes, 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 go prove that we are men. And by the time there was a year in, he was basically saying, this is not our war. Why are we doing this? So that's what the play essentially allowed me to do. And of course, I didn't find a way to write the play until I found a female character and bunged her in the middle of it. And then, of course, she's the one around whom everything revolves.
Now, you mentioned Norman Manley there, First Minister of Jamaica, a very important independence figure as well, a heroic figure. And I wondered, when you joked a little bit about getting things right, because you knew that there are people who knew his life, whether you all feel that kind of responsibility, that burden of responsibility of having maybe an historian peering over your shoulder. Did you feel that, Pat?
I actually used somebody's doctoral thesis as the basis of what I did. So I tried to root it in that way. And, having written the play and there are certain bits that I thought were quite strong, I found out that I had made one huge fundamental inaccuracy in that I had Norman ride to meet where his brother was when he was injured. And in fact, they were serving together, so it would have been just next door. But I wanted the ride. I wanted that sense of the boy from the country who knew who could tame horses, to be able to ride through enemy fire in order to get to his brother. So, a little bit of a tweak there, but I needed that moment of him braving the war in order to be at his brother's side.
Well, yeah, you were focusing more on the emotional truth there rather than the actual verifiable truth, I imagine. Now, you mentioned one point there. Go ahead, Pat, go ahead.
I was just saying that I wrote something else about World War. I realized that my brother would have been evacuated to a field hospital and then to another hospital. So in the end, he would actually have ridden. But at the time, I had trapped myself in this huge guilt about doing it wrong. So you see, history came to my rescue.
I think you can forgive yourself anyway. I remember writing about the Wailers, a very famous concert called the One Love Peace Concert in 1978.
Oh, yes,
and,
I was there for that.
I wasn't there. You were there, right? You could have helped me then, because I wrote and said it was a wine dark night, and there was a correspondent in the Observer who wrote and reviewed the book and said, no, it was a full moon that night, and it was an egregious error on my part, which meant that nothing included in the book could therefore be believed, because I made this terrible error about whether it was a full moon or whether it be.
Oh, I would not have known about the moon.
No, Ingrid, now, I think in your novel, Love After Love, which is a very fine novel, which I talked to you about earlier in the year, there are references to religion and to law, which underpin some of the history of the evolution of those institutions in Trinidad, where the book is set. Why was it important to introduce those elements in your novel? And what do you gain by that, do you think?
I think in order to understand, so there are three protagonists in the novel, and one of them is a gay man. And in order to understand his emotional truth and his journey, I think it was important to not just give a sense of the homophobia, but to show that it was underpinned by a set of rules and obligations that society was very clearly clinging on to. Opportunity after opportunity was given to repeal these laws, but it was only very recently that we've really begun to do that actively. And writing in the 21st century about the rights of gay people in the way that we experience them, in the way that the queer community experiences them in Trinidad now, I think was an eye-opener for people. And I wanted them to understand that we were doing this within a systematic oppression through the use of law. And in terms of the religion, it's that's far more complicated and difficult, because we are all immigrants, and we came off the boat from India, and we wanted to preserve what we could. And so we fossilized our practices, our Hinduism, into whatever came with us in our jaji bundles. And I wanted to just bring a little sense of the challenges that would come from outside as new and different perspectives came in. That Mother Kali, for example, was not to be feared forever. That actually she could be interpreted in a much more liberal way, as a force for good for women, and something that the protagonist Betty finds solace and a little bit of redemption in. So I absolutely needed to use those underpinnings.
Now, just a few months ago, I listened to a very fine radio or podcast adaptation of a true short stories of yours about this chap I mentioned at the beginning, Vagabond Raja, who in my mind was a kind of Reagan. So Reagan was this very famous gangster in Jamaica who terrorized the island in 1948. But I only know about Reagan because there was a film based on his life, The Harder They Come. The Jimmy Cliff character is based on Ivanhoe Reagan. And I'd never heard about John Boise Singh. And I just wondered what interested you about him. And I believe, is it true, he has seeded an idea for a novel, that you start with this true story, but it's going to yield a novel?
It's almost the other way. It started with the novel, and it yielded some non-fiction, and now it's going back into the novel. So they're definitely weaving and dancing with each other. So there is, for me, writing this is the ultimate challenge of the responsibility that Pat talked about, of truth. So Boise Singh, any kid growing up in Trinidad, really, probably not my sons who are 20, but any kind of before them, if you behave bad, your parents would say, Boise Singh will come and get you. And that was enough to get you to clean your room or eat your food or whatever it is, come inside from the dark. And so he's this mythological character that just kind of floats on the outskirts of my memory. But I kept finding that I'd made notes about him all the time. So he was in my he was just eating at my mind. And then I tried to find stories about him to say, well, why was he so prevalent in my mind when he was dead by 1957? And I couldn't find anything. There's one book that's written about him. And once I started to push, I found such resistance to talk about Boise Singh, even from my own family. We're not related to Boise Singh, but we have family who related to family who know Boise Singh them, and the aunt cousin married. Okay, you get the picture. But anyway, we have some little connection, and I started exploring these and having conversations, and everyone was reluctant to talk about Boise Singh, and I'm trying to probe what is this reluctance, and it's something about evil as they saw it, that evil was this thing that would visit them for even talking about this man. And who can resist that, as a novelist? So I had to go in. But I am acutely aware that he has grandchildren who are alive with memories of their grandfather, perhaps not direct memories, but memories that have been given to them. They have artifacts that they keep, they have diaries, they have memorabilia, and they and every time I touch this story, it touches back. So I gave a copy of Love After Love to a friend's mother, and she told me to come and say come and see her because she wanted to say thank you. And she says, "What are you working on?" And I say, "A book on Boise Singh." And she says, and I say, "It's about really looking at the women in his life. I want to find out about Boise, but through the women, because I think they were pivotal in his life, and they're just not discussed." And I said, particularly his wife Doris, and she said, "You don't mean Tanty Doris?" And here I find someone who knew Doris. And Tanty Doris used to come and visit, and she had a chauffeur-driven car, and she used to wear stockings, and she had on plenty jewelry, and she used to do her hair so and so, and blah, blah, blah. This is amazing. How can I not touch this? But how can I also do justice to this? How can I be responsible with the power that I'm being given to tell these stories? So I'm in the middle of all of the questions and issues that Umi and Pat have already raised. But I'm having a load of fun.
Good luck with that. I'm really looking forward to it. Have you got a title yet, actually, for the new novel? Are you keeping it under wraps?
I'll say I'm keeping it under wraps only because I don't have a title.
Well, I'm sure it will emerge. I'm sure it will emerge with Passoud. So, Umi, you're working on your second novel, which is a kind of follow-up, in a way, if I may be so bold, to your first novel, Beloved. And this second novel is called The Fallen. Is that correct? In what way is it related to the first novel? And can you set the scene for us? It's set in Italy during the Second World War, and it has a Sikh soldier at its center. Is that correct?
Yes, which is a kind of overlap with another famous novel that I'd rather not have it compared to. Yes, it's a Sikh soldier in Italy. He is actually mixed race, like me. Yes,
if I may be so bold, why would it be detrimental to mention the English patient?
Because who wants to be compared to Michael Ondaatje, quite honestly?
Well, if you compared favourably, then it's good, isn't it?
I sat next to him at the Jaipur Literary Festival 2 years ago, and he was clearly not wanting to talk to anybody, and I was literally sitting right beside him. And I was thinking I really shouldn't speak to him. He so clearly doesn't want to be spoken to, but I couldn't resist it. And I said to him, "I'm writing a novel set in Italy about a Sikh soldier." And every time I mention it to anyone, guess what they say? And he went, "Oh, God." So I stopped speaking to him, left him alone, poor fellow.
There's room for more than one story about a Sikh soldier in Italy, I imagine. Because this kind of brings on...
Probably is. That's what I tell myself anyway.
No, I think there isn't, and I'm sure you're going to do a great job. But also, you're going to be illuminating and educating people about things which are unknown to very many people. I didn't know that, for instance, 40% of the British Army in Italy were Indian, weren't they, for instance?
Yes, and yet, as I said, I think the first military tour that I took to Italy, I did 3 of battlefields. The first tour I took to Monte Cassino, I had informed in advance the guide who was taking us round that I was researching the Indian Army, and we spent 3 days with her. I went with a friend. she didn't mention the Indian Army once. And at the end, I was so furious. I actually really told her off. To be fair to her, she did refund my money and asked me if I could recommend any books she could read. And she subsequently put a page about the Indian Army on her website and started to include them in her tours. So I felt that was an achievement. But I think what happened with that book was that I started off, it was kind of a follow-up in a way, because there's an Indian soldier in the First World War in the first book. And I was following John Horn's thing of trying to link those three events, because they are obviously connected in the history of India's struggle for independence. But the more I looked, the more I learned about Italy and what happened there, the more I realized how completely horrific the war had been for Italians and for Italian civilians, particularly, and women. And, all the flack the Italians got after the war, being cowardly, the jokes about them, the films about them, which made it seem like it was a party, the soldiers in Italy be called the D-Day Dodgers. It just seemed so incredibly unjust. So the book kind of moved over, and I've now gotten a kind of Italian narrator as well, which has really complicated things a lot. But,
because the title of The Fallen refers not just to the fallen soldiers, but to the fallen women. Is that correct in Italy?
Yeah, because the second tour I took to Monte Cassino with a retired lieutenant colonel from the British Army and 35 soldiers. We were on the tour bus, and I'd already been warned by one of the soldiers that they were all sexist. And he stood up in front and said, Italian women, during the war, there were 94,000 prostitutes in Naples. And I actually read some books about Naples and why those women were prostitutes. Basically every respectable woman practically in Naples ended up in prostitution because it was the only way they could survive. And it's a horrific history, actually. And so obviously, again, it's told through characters and their story, standing for all that.
But it's also what you can bring to the story, which maybe a historian who's not so sensitive, is a kind of empathy and understanding, so that those women will not be people who will be criticized. There'll be some understanding as to why they find themselves in their position. And I wonder whether that's true of what's going on presently, because this is a shift, isn't it? I mean, I think a few years ago, there would be the suggestion that a woman writing about history or the Second World War, First World War, that's kind of a no-no. That's male territory. But do you think that narrative is gone now, that these stories are open and that anybody can write about them?
I don't know. I mean, I'm aware that it might be something that people say. And I'm also aware, I've never been in combat. I don't know what it's like to be on a battlefield. I mean, I'm only going on what I read and what I research. And in some ways, the Second World War is close enough that, I guess most direct living memory is gone now. But people have had stories handed down by their parents. It was very much easier dealing with stuff that happened in 1857 because it's distant enough that you're working entirely with written material, a limited range of written material. So I'm very aware of the kind of responsibility as Ingrid is with her story. But, one can only do one's best, really.
Well, if you do as well as you did for Beloved, then you'll do very well,
Belonging.
I'm sure.
I don't want to be compared to Toni Morrison either.
I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm going to be turning to Beloved next. So Belonging was your novel. But Beloved is what I'm going to be focusing on next. And the idea of the relationship between, say, a slave narrative, Pat, and fiction about slave histories, because you've adapted Toni Morrison for radio. I remember reading about a book called Barracoon, which is a book put together by Zora Neale Hurston, which is an oral history of one of the last Africans abducted from Africa and brought to America. And she said that too often the story of America had been told with journals, manifests, diaries, bills of sales, from the perspective of the beneficiaries of the slave trade. All these words for the seller, but not one word for the sold. And I wonder, Pat, what would you say is the relationship between the truthful first-person narratives of the slave narratives, people like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs, and the fiction that people like Toni Morrison has written. Is there a relationship between the two, and do they complement each other, or are they necessary? Are they paired in any way, would you say?
I certainly think, I would say complement, in the sense that, to some extent, if you're writing in standard English and you're part of that body of law, essentially you've accepted a particular structure in terms of education and achievement. Whereas I think what oddly enough, I saw it in the recent television program High on the, is that actually she has the body
I think we're going to. Pat, your sound isn't great, so we're going to pause the question to you, and we're going to move on to Ingrid, and maybe we can tweak your sound in a bit. If you hold that thought, Pat, we'll come back to. I wonder, Ingrid, whether we could just explore this sort of basic idea about the value of historical fiction. So, like many people on the planet now, I've been entranced by the work of Hilary Mantel, and telling the story from Wolf Hall onwards. And I think, in all honesty, when I think of that period now about Thomas Cromwell, I think of Hilary Mantel's telling of that story. Is that problematic as far as you're concerned? If you were a historian, would you find that problematic, you think? And is that problematic to you as a reader, that you might default to the fiction rather than the history book?
I think there's a problem if you consider it as truth, as there being one truth. And if you I think not so much with Hilary Mantel's work, because it is so nuanced, but I'm thinking of film being conveying what JFK stood for, or Nixon, and those being the lens through which a whole generation decides to understand these characters without seeking other sources. So I find those as sources of information and truth and history more problematic. That storytelling, that filmic storytelling. Hilary Mantel's work, of course, is so rich in terms of giving us a version and a truth that we can hold on to, perhaps more readily than, as you said, than the history books might have presented. When someone says, "Do you want to understand Cromwell?" I'm going to give my kid Hilary Mantel's book to start off with. If they ask me about slavery, I'm going to give them Toni Morrison's Beloved. And they'll say, "But that's so lyrical. And, Mom, you're just interested in the sentences and how she constructs things." No, she takes a newspaper clipping about a woman who kills her children in order to prevent them going into servitude. And Toni Morrison takes this newspaper clipping and builds her whole story. And it's that kernel, it's that understanding that she permeates her whole story with. Or like To Kill a Mockingbird, the way we use the innocence of the child to reflect that kernel of truth. So I'm biased, but I think we have such sophisticated storytelling in literature that it would be wrong to dismiss it. Particularly, in a case like mine with Boise Sing, I'm writing in a vacuum. I'm writing to get the stories that have not been told, just as you said at the beginning with Lonely Londoners, filling that void for you. I'm filling the void of the boogeyman of my childhood. And that's, you know, what's informing so much of my writing.
Thank
But
you. Ingrid. I
Pat,
wonder whether
are you back?
Pat, yes, I wonder whether, if
I
you're
hope
back, I
so.
wonder, Pat, whether can you speak about your adaptation and whether you agree with Ingrid's assessment about the richness of Beloved?
Absolutely. I mean, the adapting was hard because the subtlety of her structure means that actually where one alphabet ends is where the other begins, and she intertwines both of them.
Yes.
But I have to say, the thing that I absolutely love is that she gives the characters who have never had a voice before rich lives, loving lives, celebratory lives, things that are wonderful about their lives, which in fact you don't get from the dry narrative, and you certainly don't get from the victor's narrative. And in that way, I think she elevates them to a position where they're kind of iconic in their own right. And to as you say, take it from a newspaper article and make it that's magic, man. That's just you know, you stand in awe basically of something like that.
Yes.
I agree. Ingrid, sorry, Umi, I wonder whether we can talk about the difficulty of writing about horrific stuff. So in Belonging, you're writing about some terrible violence, and I wonder to what degree did you self-censor yourself when it came to writing and mediating the violence for the reader?
I didn't censor myself very much, but I had other people suggest to me that maybe I should. So a friend said to me when he read the descriptions of the massacre at Kanpur that it was the Kali in me coming out, the anger, but it was too much for the reader. And I did actually cut it's probably a 40-page section that kind of went through everything that happened to them down to half a page. And it was so much more intense and better for it.
Can we just
But
backtrack a little bit?
I recently read a review of the...
Can we just explain about the incident itself before we go on to talk about the review? But can we explain what the violence was that you've had to address?
Well, basically, about 200 women and children were shut into a house in Kanpur after they'd been besieged in a kind of open space with a low wall for, I can't remember exactly how long, I'm afraid. English women and children. And soldiers were ordered to kill them, but refused, Indian soldiers. And eventually they were massacred by some butchers. And it was a horrific incident, but then the British reprisals afterwards were equally horrific. And there was terrible violence on both sides, both before and after the events. But yes, this review, just somebody said that as she was reading it, she kept thinking, more suffering? Really? Which actually made me laugh, because I thought, yeah, I'm afraid the second book is not very different.
Can I ask you also about your choice of characters and your focus? Because can I say, shoot me down if I'm being ridiculous, are you Anglo-Indian, would you say that? If you are, or if you have some semblance of being an Anglo-Indian, why you've chosen to focus on the English characters rather than the Indian ones? Because in my ignorance, I would have assumed that you might have focused on the colonized rather than the colonizers.
I think that's why I did it, because I wanted to show, I think it's fairly obvious that colonized people are oppressed and therefore suffer. What I think I wanted to show is the damage it does to people when you are actually the oppressor. Because in a way, I think perhaps that's a bit more educational for people who are a bit unaware. I think my characters are not people who are necessarily believers in the colonial system, but they are caught up in it. And the damage it does to them, I think, is quite catastrophic. So I think I just felt that was a more interesting angle to explore, really.
I wonder if I could open this point generally now about the value of fiction writing in exploring areas where there are no written records. So Benedict Evaristo, who's a great writer, wrote a book called Emperor's Babe about 20 years ago, in which she has a Sudanese woman in I think it's 2011 AD, 211 AD, sorry, who's married to a Roman man, and I think they're living in Londinium, 211 AD, and the wealthy Roman man is away, and whilst he's away, Emperor Septimius Severus comes into town, and the main woman, the narrator, has an affair with him. And what interested me was that outside of reading about the Emperor Septimus Severus in a book by Peter Fryer called Staying Power, which is a kind of history of black people in Britain, I didn't have any conception about what a black person in this country would have been doing in 211 AD. And so you need a fiction person, presumably, to be wanting to be fleshing that out for the reader when there's no other source, there's no other stories being told. So is there value there, do you think, in fiction writers delving into worlds that have not been articulated or visualized or written? Who wants to jump in? Pat, you're looking thoughtful.
I think there is. Absolutely. I mean, there's always a level of information that you want to get across. I think sometimes when you're writing from a minority position, that you sometimes feel that you take a slightly preachy tone. And I thought Septimus Severus was one of those things that everybody, should know about, and therefore we should do something about. But it allows the imagination to fly. It also allows you to humanize and to imagine what those contexts would be. But I think the most important thing is that it actually places us and the people we're interested in those times. I've come up through so many generations or decades where essentially we were told, find a white protagonist so that they'll find the way into the story for the audience. And when you take that space and say, nope, not going to do that. That's not how I'm going to write. That in itself is empowering. So whether or not it's accurate, whether or not, for whatever reason that it was written, the writing of it is an important act. The taking of that space, the fact that I'm going to write it.
When you were told by the people telling you to find a white protagonist, why were they saying that, do you think?
Because essentially when you're coming from a very small island in the Caribbean and you want to go on to sell something that actually makes any money, and this would have been in the 80s and 90s, we will get in lots of people from America, from England, who come in and give us workshops and say, well, nobody wants to actually hear these stories. What you have to do, it's like Tom Cruise and Cocktail. It's Jamaica's the setting, but the characters are white. And we were essentially told this over and over again. So, I mean, Beloved hit me like, like a blow in the face, because it basically said, stop the nonsense and just get on with doing it. And I think I went from being somebody who could write a bit to somebody who wanted to be a writer because of reading that taking of that space. I think we should. Why not?
Ingrid, do you agree?
I just had another thought. Some genre writing that we, the three of us writers here, four of us here, may not be considering, which is science fiction, which is the opposite. Taking us into the future and imagining us into a space and writing us into that space, and the extraordinarily imaginative work of people like Marlon James doing it in some ways, and there's a writer from Barbados. His name is Lord, and I think we're claiming both the past and the future in time, and isn't that wonderful?
Is the future easier to claim?
No, it isn't. No, I don't think it is, because one's understanding of the future is always informed by the past and the present. So It can't be. Gene Roddenberry was a genius, but the rest of us are going to struggle to have that sort of imagination grounded in an understanding of the present and the past.
Thank you. Umi, let's return back to the English patient a little bit, because I think this is a problem in that there's this perception that there is only a finite number of stories that can be told about an Indian soldier, for instance. And what you're doing, you're complicating that story. You're saying, no, there's room for more and more of these stories, and we can't just focus on the exceptionalism that has been portrayed in the past. There's only room for one person talking about Indian soldiers in Italy. Don't you? Are you able to shrug and get Michael Ondaatje off your shoulder?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, I'm joking. I mean, yeah, it's not a big issue.
Yeah, well, I'm glad of that, because I'm very much looking forward to reading The Fallen, and to
as long
to
as
think
nobody
about
promotes it by saying sorry. As long as nobody promotes it by saying it's the new English patient.
Yeah, no, there is that temptation, isn't there? That kind of Amazon temptation of comparison, and that's sometimes how books are sold, I believe, because people are familiar with what's gone in the past, and they want to find something that resonates with them today. But to draw this conversation to a close, I wonder whether we could spend some little time now thinking about what particular work of fiction you might want to flag up as worthy of also being interrogated as history. So for me, I'll start the ball rolling. I've given this some thought. I am very impressed by the work of the playwright Howard Barker, who's written a number of history plays. And he wrote a very fine play, which is actually made into a radio play, called Scenes from an Execution. I wonder whether anybody knows it. It's about a commissioned artist who's painting a canvas about a triumphant battle at Lepanto. But she makes the mistake of not painting it in a celebratory way, but painting it as a kind of war-torn carnage. And oops, for her truth-telling, she gets incarcerated by the authorities. And when I heard that play, I think it was Fiona Shaw played the part. What it was able to do was to talk about this very dark and terrible period, but also with wit and humour and some kind of sense of hope. Although there's some harsh things said. There's one scene where someone's being flogged, and the man in charge says, "Flog that man," and the other guy says, "Why?" "No reason. Flog that man for no reason." And there's a kind of anarchism that comes through in the writing of Scenes from an Execution, but it's underpinned by the sense that that hope will win out in the end. So I wonder what other writing we might flag up for our readers. Let's start with Ingrid. What would you say, Ingrid?
So one of my favorite writers is Colson Whitehead. The Nickel Boys I read in one sitting. And the Underground Railway took me a little more than one sitting, but really could not tear myself away from it. And I think his work, there's clearly a lot of very careful research goes into the writing, but then the writing is free and imaginative and rich. And I think we see that so much in the Underground Railroad in particular. In fact, it's so imaginative that among the awards that book got was one for science fiction, because they said, well, he's made this entire thing up, in some senses. So I really do love his work.
Is science fiction for the Underground Railroad?
Yes, he did.
Okay, yeah. So to explain to the readers, the Underground Railroad was a name given to the safe houses that enslaved people might find in their passage from the south plantations to freedom in the north. But in Colson Whitehead's wonderful conception, the Underground Railroad is a real railroad that has been dug under the slave states. So it's a wonderful idea, and it is science fiction in a way, as you described.
Yeah, and it just they sort of pop up, from time to time. Oh, we'll just pop up and we're here, and we're so somebody said, this book is so brilliant, we're just going to give it the science fiction award as well as everything else it won.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for that, Ingrid. Pat, what would you say to the reader, to the listener who's watching tonight? What fictional book also has historical impact, would you say?
This is fairly recent. It's Murky Book's first publication, We Are All Birds of Uganda, by Hafsa Zayan. I hope I've said it correctly. I abridged it, so I'm sort of well acquainted with it. But it talks about the in parallel what happens with a young Muslim in London now, trying to have his faith with being in the city. But more from the historical point of view is the pressures building up to the Amin's decision to drive the Asians out of Uganda. But it looks at it from the point of view of the Black and the Asian population, and it's not very much about the British at all, except as, the people who maybe governed or arranged the situation in some way. And in that, explores it through personal relationships and all sorts of revelations. But it so celebrates Uganda as the most beautiful, verdant, lovely place. And the characters are beautifully drawn, and such a young writer to do that. Yeah, but she's talking about the 60s and 70s, but in a completely fresh way.
Thank you, Pat. And finally, Umi, what would you say to draw people's attention to?
Well, I think as part of the reading I did, I came across History, a novel by Elsa Morante, which is set in Italy in the Second World War. And it's a brilliant book, absolutely brilliant. She's got such a wonderful, there's humor, there's compassion, there's satire as well. She comes through as very satirical and very intelligent. But it's a kind of heartbreaking story about this rather simple woman who's raped by a German soldier, and he has this little boy who's a severe epileptic. And it's, and they're trying to survive in Italy. And I think, her husband was much more famous than she was abroad. Anyway, I believe she's very well respected in Italy, Alberto Moravia. And when I read the book, I was like, why is he more famous than she is? Because I thought it was an absolutely brilliant book.
Well, thank you, Umi Sinha. Thank you, Pat Cumper. And thank you, Ingrid Passoud. You've been listening and watching Writers Mosaic. You couldn't make it up, could you? We are going to have this film recorded, and it will be available on our site, writersmosaic.org.uk. Please visit us, and please stay tuned for future presentations. So once more to Pat, Umi, and Ingrid, and to all of you, thank you for listening, and good night.